Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our CSEC lecture series. And thank you for tuning in to another episode. This lecture series is a collaborative effort between the University of the West Indies History and Archaeological Department and the Institute of Jamaica. And my name is Alexis McDavid, and I am the Outreach Officer at National Museum Jamaica, which is a division of the Institute of Jamaica. And here with me today, I have Professor James Robertson. And just to give you a short introduction for Professor Robertson, his full bio will be linked in the description box on our social media platforms. Professor Robertson is a past president of both the Archaeological Society of Jamaica and the Jamaican Historical Society. He's the author of countless books, and he has written on English and Jamaican history, including archives, the Chinese in Jamaica, Creole architecture, early settlement patterns, and so on. And right now he is a member of the board of, he's a member on the board of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust and the National Museum Jamaica, my division, as well as the National Archives Committee. And he will be discussing theme 2 on the CSEC syllabus, which is Caribbean economy and slavery. And the topic is marginal crops, mahogany, logwood, cotton, coffee, and cocoa production. Thank you so much, Prof. Robertson, for joining us today for our lecture series.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to kick things off, I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to be a secondary crop in the Sugar Islands, and why did minor crops matter?
Well, for a secondary crop I think you need to recognize that in marketing stuff like mahogany or coffee, that they're being sold within a trading system that's set up for sugar. By the late 17th century and through up to the 1840s, sugar is privileged. It has tariffs if it's sold in England or in Britain. As a result, sugar gets a better crop if the cargo is unloaded in London or Bristol or wherever because of the tax deals. The difficulty is if you bring your coffee or your ginger or your other secondary crops, they might actually have got a better deal if you'd been able to take them directly to Hamburg or somewhere else in continental Europe. But because you've got to drop them off in London first or in England first, the merchants there may well offer a lower price and the taxes will be higher, because the tax system for the West Indies is set up for sugar, and every other crop from the West Indies is having to go through a template that works for sugar, but isn't necessarily so good for selling something like coffee.
So how were they identified, and can we put a sense of time on these crops?
Well, in part, I think we've got the desire to sell things. When the settlements begin to happen in the West Indies, it's the search for crops and search for exports that makes people do the transatlantic voyages. The Dutch, who had traded with the Spaniards a lot earlier, when they start having their civil war and rebellion against the Spaniards in the 1560s, they start going to the West Indies because they used to buy their salt from Spain, and now they're fighting Spain. They go to places like the Dutch islands because they are small and dry and miserable, but they're also really good for doing salt. The English, and to a degree the French, are both there because they're trying to get export crops. To a degree, they start by looking at export crops that are already selling in Europe, like sugar. And then they start trying to experiment with other crops. So if you look at early Barbados, there's attempts to grow rhubarb, there's attempts to grow ginger, and the rest. And if you look at Jamaica, you can see that Jamaica's agricultural history is punctuated with attempts to find a new crop or a new crop or a new crop. Jamaica's different from the other British islands that it was captured from the Spaniards, and therefore it's the only island that a Protestant nation has their hands on that has some of the commercial export crops from mainland Latin America or Central America. There's an attempt to grow cocoa, and for the first 1660 to 1670, cocoa is the crop that seems most promising for exports from Jamaica. And then there's a blight, and it collapses and sugar takes over. But you also get attempts to grow other tropical crops like indigo, which is undercut because it can be produced more cheaply in the Indian subcontinent. But right the way through Jamaican history and the other islands' history, you can see attempts to bring in alternative crops. Cotton is one of them. And at intervals, there's attempts to bring in cotton, either as a substitute or for secondary lands. So number one, what we've got with secondary crops is right across the sugar triumph in the British West Indies, which is plus or minus 1650, maybe the late 1640s for Barbados, up to the abolition of the preferential duties in the 1840s. And even then, you've still got sugar as the major crop, but again, attempts to do secondaries as well. So at one level, the secondary crops are what sugar initially was. Sugar starts off as an effort with a new crop, and then it takes off and does well and has ruined teeth in England for 300 years. But you've got other efforts to have crops as well. And I think what you get with the other crops, and this shows up in Jamaica, but you can see it in other islands too, is the efforts to find alternative uses for land and land that can't be used for sugar. So that's where you see coffee being developed or attempted from the 1720s, and then really taking off in the 1790s when the great French sugar or French coffee plantations in Saint-Domingue are in the middle of a revolt. And therefore, even Jamaican coffee can get a market. So there had been Jamaican coffee, and it had had a market beforehand, but it hadn't had the premium market that French coffees had had before the revolution. So that's two answers of why secondary. I think one is that the primary tends to be sugar. But if you look at Grenada in the mid-18th century, there it moves pretty fast to nutmeg, which is far more profitable because you can't get it otherwise outside the Indian Ocean. So there are places where, and for mahogany, which is unlike the other crops because it is indigenous, it's grown within the region. It's the growth area for mahogany is most of the Caribbean. You can get some of it in Florida, southern Florida. And it's initially developed by the Spaniards for naval goods in the 17th century. But mahogany takes off in the 18th century. But there it's logging out an indigenous timber. And then you get the extension of mahogany over to British Honduras, now Belize, where it continues to be a key part of the economy well into the 19th and early 20th centuries. So there, you've got the degree of secondary crops. So again, coffee, mahogany fits in the margins of the economies for the sugar islands. In part, when you're when land is being cleared, mahogany, logwood, the other hardwoods from the Caribbean hardwoods are going to have to be cut down. I think one of the trees was known by the enslaved as the break axe tree. Just the sheer labor of clearing this forest must have been miserable. But in the process, you've got with both logwood, which can be used as a dye wood, and with mahogany that can be used as it's water resistant. It has oil in it, which means that it doesn't rot so fast, again, like the cedar from Bermuda. So these are both good shipbuilding woods. And these woods, therefore, get a premium as exports. And I think the third strand I wanted to look at this is for the secondary timber, the secondary products, is that they are what you can grow on a land that isn't so suitable for sugar. And if you look at the broader sugar economy, where Vereen Shepherd's remarkable work looking at cattle raising and the cattle pens, whereby the cattle pens produced the oxen that then turned the wheels for the sugar mills and hauled those amazing wagons loaded with sugar, which must have been absolutely miserable to get through muddy roads. And so you needed oxen to tow these infernal wagons down towards the ports or buckwadiers and jetties where the ships could pick this heavy stuff up. But if you look at the rest of the economy, there's sort of areas that the land isn't good enough for sugar. And that's where you start getting people trying to go coffee in particular, but attempts at things like cotton as well. In some ways, cotton doesn't do so well for profits, but you see it coming back in the Bahamas. When the Bahamas don't work for sugar, you can see when sugar collapses in the 19th century that Montserrat goes over towards cotton in the late 19th century. So these are ones that fit around the edge of the sugar economy. Right. Does that answer your question, or have I gone off too many tangents?
That's great. Thanks, Prof. For my next question, what sort of labor practices were there on these estates, and did they vary much before and after emancipation?
Again, yes. I think that the labor practices are important. We've got a great emphasis when we look at the labor on the sugar estate, and what's come up with the demographic work is that basically the sugar estates were killing spaces. You look at the massive numbers of unfree Africans dragged in to the West Indies, and the absolutely terrible birth rates and figures. You don't get a positive birth rate in the Caribbean for the ex-slaves until post-emancipation. You don't. So in this period of negative birth rates and fairly high turnover on the sugar estates, what seems striking is that on the pens, and I think that would also include things like the coffee estates, and there's the National Library of Jamaica has a manuscript notebook. The handwriting is not very good, but it's the letter book of a Liverpool-based silversmith who inherited a share in a ginger plantation on the north side of Jamaica. And he's desperately trying to find out, how does it work? And I was struck by somebody giving criticism and telling him he was doing things wrong because there wasn't much turnover on his estate. And what I think we might find striking about these secondary crops is they don't have the same death rates. They're not the same death warrant as the sugar estates were. And there's again, if you look, I don't know how many of you have looked at Erna Brodber's fiction. She's a Jamaican novelist, but her PhD was in history. And she also worked as a sociologist. And she's been doing work on the estate where she was brought up, former coffee estate up in St. Mary, Woodside. And there she's been able to find the genealogies of a fair number of the enslaved families on the estate. They're brought over in the aftermath of the American War for Independence, and are then settled on a coffee estate in St. Mary, in rural St. Mary in Jamaica. And it looks as if a fair number of the families have managed to survive. This seems a very different experience than you get on the sugar estates. And there may be a degree that the secondary crops may have been places with a different demographic lifespan and also possibly a different potential for the carryover of traditions from Africa or from the cohorts of the initial settlers, rather than the other places that change over rather faster. But I'd love to be wrong in that. But I think we ought to recognize the different demographic experiences of life growing some of the secondary crops or on those pens where there's the cattle, where there's a nearer to families and survival rather earlier in the system than there is on the sugar estates. And so if we look at it, what does it mean for the people who are doing the work? Is it may mean a greater chance of having grandchildren or of having an issue who live beyond 10 minutes after birth.
Continue, Prof.
No, that was that point.
Okay. So the marginal crops of the sugar era were on the margins of sugar-based economies. So from the 1840s, these economies were in trouble, and island leadership sought for alternative crops that could supplement or supersede sugar. How far was this search continuing a process of searching for alternative export crops to cultivate in the West Indies?
On one level, I think almost directly, though again, there is the exception, which is Belize. Belize is exceptional in so many ways, but one of the ways is that it's not so directly based on sugar. And therefore, the Belize, they continue with the mahogany crop. Again, there's a wonderful book, All Well Here at Home, published by Kubola in Belize. That's the accounts of an overseer on one particular estate of what does it mean. But there you have the different experience of the log cutters going out into the bush looking for these trees and hunting for them, and then spending ages cutting them down, towing them to river, and then getting them off the river and aboard. And now we've got one dynamic that starts off on the edge of the sugar estates. When they do this in Jamaica, for example, again, you begin to get logging crews from about the mid 1700s. But what you've got post-emancipation is, or at least within a decade of emancipation, is the collapse of the sugar duties that had helped keep the domestic market in Britain getting sugar. And it's been argued that during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the diet of sort of how on earth were they fed? And one answer is that Britain had been able to import sugar and then use more of the fruits and vegetables that were coming in terms of jams and pies and all those other things that give you terrible British dentistry. And the degree that sugar had provided the calories that helped allow the initial European industrial takeoff into industrialization. But once you move into the late 19th century, or mid to late 19th century, the British islands, and to a degree I think the French and Dutch as well, begin to lose the fiscal protection that had propped up sugar and kept sugar profitable into the early 19th century. And when you're losing the profits of sugar, then what on earth are you going to grow instead? And in part, you get the abandonment of marginal estates. And it looks striking that a fair number of estates and areas in Jamaica, one might look at southern St. Anne, where new roads are being built in the 1820s, but by the 1860s, the land again is dropping back into peasant farming. And there you get a shift, and in part, desperate attempts to find alternative crops. And on the other hand, where the local assemblies, which are still dominated by the planters, are tempted to prop up sugar. But where you've got other efforts to grow new things instead, can you grow silk? And there are attempts to grow silk in Jamaica, there are attempts to grow silk in Montserrat. And the difficulty is that these crops, again, are difficult to grow. One of the benefits of sugar is that even a bunch of fairly ignorant Europeans arriving and using brute force are able to make sugar grow unless you hit it with a hurricane or something. When you try and grow indigo, if you get indigo wrong, you've got compost and no crop at all. If you really muck up with your sugar, then unless it leaks out of badly made barrels, or there was one occasion where somebody used poison wood to make the barrels and nothing could be done with what was put in them. But otherwise, even badly refined sugar, once it gets to England, is going to be re-refined and you'll get something for it. If you get your attempts to go silk wrong, you've just got a pile of dead silkworms and maybe some bushes growing mulberries that you don't know what to do anything with. So some of the difficulties is the alternative crops get more difficult, but you can see certainly the efforts to grow cotton in the late 19th century Caribbean, some of the Eastern Caribbean islands, the attempts to bring in coconut, to do coconut oil and the rest. And I think in some ways what you need to see is rather than that sugar was natural, which is what the sugar lobby in London is going to lobby, what the fatter planters and absentees who are getting their profits off sugar are going to say you need to prop up sugar to the government. If you're actually out in the individual islands, or you're trying not to fall asleep over the dinner table conversation at Government House, there the discussion may well be, can we grow something else? And that's where you can see the botanical gardens, both in St. Vincent and in Jamaica, as desperately trying to find new crops that can be grown. There are attempts to grow tea in Jamaica that carry on from the 1860s through to the 1880s. And there are various other types of plants. Can we bring in this? Can we bring in that? And there's an effort in the 1730s. Can you grow, the cacti on which the beetles that allow you to have a wonderful red dye. I'm blanking on the title of the dye. And these efforts to get new crops continue right through Jamaican and West Indian history. I was thinking of this in particular in terms of Montserrat, where they develop a niche crop in the late 19th century with limes. They're growing the limes for lime juice, the main brand of lime juice on sale in England. And then they're hit by a succession of beetles through the 1930s and are desperately looking for something else. In the short term, they go to cotton. And then in the 1950s, the British government pulls the plug on subsidies for cotton growing. And they try, we'll have a cannery. We will grow tomatoes and produce tinned tomatoes. And they try that for 2 years and it fails. And then in Montserrat, they make a different joke. They go towards villas. And so the land that had been used for sugar, for limes, for cotton, and then maybe those tomatoes, is instead sold off to elite purchasers. And you then get money growing from the building work and employment, setting up the building. And then you get work produced by this in gardening and cooking and catering to the prosperous foreigners who've bought these villas. And one might see in Montserrat in particular, how far has the villa been the succession crop to the sugarcane fields? I'm not sure how far for the other islands, where again the coastal plain is getting superseded by hotels. If this is another type of crop, where again you're getting a local product, hospitality, and using it to get international capital. It's slightly different, the dynamics are different, but the use of the land, in Montserrat at least, there's been some arguments about continuity.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Robertson, for coming on Zoom with us today to do this talk. We really appreciate it. And we just want to tell everyone, please subscribe and follow us on our social media platforms. the Institute of Jamaica, National Museum Jamaica, the Department of History and Archaeology. Just please stay safe and stay tuned for our next episode. And thanks again, Prof.
It's a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.